The day peace met chaos. The morning had the kind of quiet that wrapped around the soul like a warm blanket. Mist curled over Crystal Cedar Lake, a silver ribbon between pine-covered ridges. Birds trilled somewhere deep in the trees, and the air smelled like rain and cedar wood. For the first time in years, I felt free. I set the last box on the old wooden porch of my new cabin, a humble two-bedroom place my late grandfather had left behind. Its logs were darkened by age, its roof patched but sturdy, and the lake stretched like a mirror just steps away. I had been working a corporate job for 10 years in the city, burnt out by fake smiles, endless deadlines, and the feeling that my life belonged to everyone but me. The cabin was supposed to be my fresh start. I was halfway through unloading the moving truck when the peace shattered. A distant wail, sharp, mechanical, cut through the sound of the wind. Sirens. Not one, but two. At first, I thought maybe there'd been an accident on the old dirt road that wound down from the highway, but the noise grew louder, echoing off the lake until two police cruisers burst through the curve like predators in a chase, dust clouds exploding behind them. They skidded to a stop right next to my moving truck, tires biting into the gravel. I froze, still holding a box labeled kitchen, fragile, and blinked in disbelief. The driver's door slammed open. Out stepped a woman in a blindingly bright turquoise tracksuit, visor glittering in the sun like a crown. She carried a clipboard like it was a sword of justice. Behind her came two officers, one older with a weary face, one younger who looked like he wanted to be anywhere else. The woman pointed directly at me. "There, that's the man. He's trespassing on private HOA property." The younger cop raised an eyebrow. "Ma'am, can you repeat that?" She stomped forward, shoes crunching on the gravel. "He's not supposed to be here. This cabin is within Cedar Shores Estate's jurisdiction. We have bylaws, regulations. He's violating all of them." I blinked, utterly confused. What?" She cut me off with a sharp flick of her wrist. "Don't you what me, young man. You've been here since sunrise, hammering, shouting, disturbing our peace. And look at that truck, it's blocking the lake view for our residents." I looked over my shoulder. My truck wasn't even facing the water. It sat tucked by the tree line. "Ma'am," the older officer said, carefully rubbing his temple. "This is a public road. What exactly is the issue here?" "The issue," she snapped, "is that this man has not gone through our mandatory approval process to live in this community. I'm the HOA president, and every new resident must attend our orientation, pay fees, and receive authorization from the board before moving in." I set the box down gently. "My name is Ethan Parker," I said, keeping my voice calm. "This is my property. I bought it legally. I can show you the deed." The woman, who I'd soon learn was Linda Crawford, self-proclaimed queen of Cedar Shores Estates, squinted at me as though I'd just claimed to own the moon. "That's impossible," she hissed. "All lakeside properties belong under our homeowners association." I would know. I oversee every transaction. I pulled out my phone, scrolled through my digital files, and showed the officer my proof of ownership. The property used to belong to my grandfather, Charles Parker. He built this cabin in 1971. It's been privately owned since before your development even existed. The older officer studied the document, nodded once, and handed my phone back. "Everything checks out, ma'am. Mr. Parker owns this place outright." Linda's mouth opened, then closed, then opened again like a fish gasping for air. That can't be. This is an HOA community."
"He can't just opt out."
"Actually," said the younger cop, clearly trying not to laugh, "if his property predates your HOA, he can." Linda's eyes turned cold, calculating. "We'll see about that. Nobody makes a fool of me, Mr. Parker. You'll regret this." She spun on her heel and stormed off, her turquoise sneakers squeaking against the gravel. The officers gave me a sympathetic look. The older one said quietly, "Welcome to the lake, son. You might want to invest in some patience. That woman runs this neighborhood like a military base." The younger officer snorted, "Or like a bad reality show." They left soon after, leaving me standing on my porch surrounded by boxes and dust, wondering what on earth I'd just walked into. By noon, I found out exactly what Linda returned, not with police this time, but with a folding chair, a thermos, and a camera lens so long it could have captured wildlife on Mars. She set up camp just outside my property line, scribbling on her clipboard every few seconds. When I opened a sandwich on the porch, she pointed her lens at it, Improper food storage, she barked. That's a bear hazard. Violation of Section 4A. It's just a sandwich, I muttered. She ignored me completely and wrote something down. When I moved a chair to face the lake, she shouted again. Unauthorized furniture placement on the shoreline. By evening, she had compiled what she proudly announced as a full report of observed violations. She marched up to my fence and tried to hand me a stack of papers. I didn't take them. Ma'am, I'm not in your HOA, I said evenly. She smiled, thin and sharp. You are now. Cedar Shores Estates covers all properties within a half-mile of the lake. That includes you. You'll receive your first bill shortly. $450 for annual dues plus $75 for orientation fees. I laughed. Not out of humor, but disbelief. You can't just invent jurisdiction. This isn't your land. Her eyes gleamed. Watch me. Over the next few days, Linda's harassment escalated. At 7 a.m. every morning, she arrived with a new citation. One day it was for noise. I'd dropped a hammer while fixing a window. The next for non-regulation trash bins. Because mine were forest green instead of slate gray. She even fined me $100 for unauthorized dock activity. I didn't even have a dock yet. Neighbors started whispering. Some sympathized. A few looked away, too afraid to cross her. Cedar Shores had lived under Linda's iron rule for years. She fined people for garden gnomes, for wind chimes that weren't aesthetically neutral, even for parking a kayak too close to the path. I began to realize something deeper. This wasn't just about me. It was about control. Linda had built her life around power. The HOA was her kingdom and I was a threat to her illusion of dominance. But I wasn't some city pushover anymore. I'd left that life behind. I wasn't here to fight. I just wanted peace, and I'd fight only if I had to. Unfortunately, Linda didn't understand peace. On the fourth day, I came home from town to find something new. Bright orange tape crisscrossed my small wooden shed like a crime scene. A laminated sign flapped in the wind. Property under review. HOA infraction notice. Underneath in Linda's handwriting was written, illegal structure within restricted aesthetic boundaries. Pending HOA demolition approval. My hands trembled, not from fear, but fury. I ripped the sign down and threw it on the ground. That's when I noticed 3 people standing across the fence, 2 women and a man, all wearing matching turquoise visors. They were taking photos. Linda had formed what she proudly called the community compliance team. Everywhere I went, they followed, cameras ready, clipboards in hand. That evening, as the sun set and mist rose over the lake again, I sat on the porch with my dog Milo and whispered, "She's not going to stop, is she?" He wagged his tail and laid his head on my knee as if to say, "Not unless you make her." He handed me a stack of papers. "These are internal emails. You didn't get them from me." When I read through them later that night, my jaw clenched tighter with every line. It was proof, written proof, of everything I suspected. Linda and a few board members had knowingly extended their HOA map, forged signatures to include properties that never opted in, and even coordinated fines to encourage compliance through consistent pressure. One line stood out, chilling in its arrogance. People fall in line when you make them believe they're already part of the system. That was it. That was the smoking gun. I spent the next 2 days compiling a detailed report with every document, every photograph, and every recorded citation. I didn't just want Linda stopped, I wanted her exposed. When I finished, I emailed copies to the county attorney, the state investigators, and a few local news outlets. The next morning, a white envelope appeared in my mailbox. Inside was a handwritten note on pink stationery that smelled faintly of perfume. "Enjoy your little victory, Mr. Parker. You think you've won, but you don't understand how this world works. People like me build order. People like you create chaos. And when this is over, you'll be the one leaving this lake, not me." No signature, but I didn't need one. I folded the note carefully, slipped it into a folder labeled Evidence, and smiled to myself. The storm had officially begun, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel powerless. I felt purposeful. This wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about justice, not just for me, but for everyone Linda had bullied into silence. The lake was quiet again that night. The moon shimmered across the surface, reflecting my cabin's light in ripples of silver. I sat on the porch with Milo at my feet. the air heavy with the scent of pine and coming rain. Somewhere across the water I saw Linda's porch light flicker on, her silhouette pacing back and forth inside her glass-walled living room. She was preparing for a fight. But so was I. And this time, the law and the truth were on my side. The mirror he never wanted to see days turned into weeks after the confrontation in the kitchen, and the mansion that once echoed with authority and sharp orders began to hum with a quiet, unfamiliar tension. The millionaire Alexander Rowe found himself in an odd new world, one where silence made him uneasy and the absence of confrontation felt heavier than a storm. For years he had operated under the illusion that wealth justified cruelty, that people's fear equaled respect. But now, whenever he entered a room, he could feel the weight of his own words replaying in his mind. Words that had cut deep, not only into others, but into his own humanity. Amelia, the nanny he had humiliated, carried herself with the same quiet dignity that had both unsettled and intrigued him. She didn't seek revenge, didn't attempt to expose him. She simply worked calm and steady, caring for his mother with compassion that outshined the staff's fear. And that silent strength became his mirror, reflecting everything he had been too blind to see about himself. One evening, as the sky outside burned gold with sunset, Alexander found himself standing by his mother's bedside. She was frail, her eyes dim yet kind, her hand resting gently in Amelia's as the younger woman fed her soup with patience. "You look tired, Alex," his mother murmured softly, her voice thin but still holding warmth. "You work so hard, but I wonder if you even know why anymore." Her words struck a place inside him he didn't know still existed. For a moment he didn't answer. He watched Amelia carefully tuck a blanket around his mother's shoulders, the smallest smile gracing her lips as she whispered something that made the old woman laugh. That laugh, light, fragile, real, was something he hadn't heard in years. It pierced through the cold, sterile atmosphere of his mansion and landed like a stone in his chest. When his mother fell asleep, he walked out into the hall, the sound of his own heartbeat loud in his ears. He realized then that all the boardrooms, the headlines, the luxury had built walls so high that not even his own soul could see the sun anymore. The next morning, he did something no one in his company had ever witnessed. He arrived at work without his driver, without the crisp perfection of his suit, and without the commanding arrogance that had once made even his executives tremble. Instead, he quietly walked into the employee cafeteria. Conversations halted, eyes widened. No one knew how to react when their powerful CEO walked past them carrying a tray of plain coffee and toast. But he wasn't there to make a scene. He sat alone in a corner, watching the people who fueled his empire. The janitors, the assistants, the exhausted faces behind the machines that made his millions possible. And for the first time, he didn't see them as tools or numbers on a balance sheet. He saw them as human beings, struggling, dreaming, living. The realization was both humbling and horrifying. Every smirk he'd given, every insult he'd thrown had chipped away not at their spirit but at his own soul. That night when he returned home, he found Amelia in the garden, kneeling beside a patch of flowers she'd revived. He stood there quietly before finally saying, "You were right. I never saw what was in front of me." She looked up, her eyes calm, not triumphant. "You can't change the past, Mr. Rowe," she said gently. "But you can stop living like it owns you." Her words, simple and unpolished, carried more power than any business deal he had ever closed. And for the first time in his life, he bowed his head, not out of shame, but out of respect. The weight of redemption. The days that followed became a quiet test of Alexander's sincerity. Change was not something that could be ordered like a shipment or built like a mansion. It had to be lived, and it had to hurt. Every morning he woke before dawn, a habit once reserved for early stock meetings, but now he used those hours to walk through the corridors of his empty home. It was strange how the same marble floors that once echoed with the sound of his expensive shoes now reminded him of isolation. The walls, once symbols of his success, now whispered of loneliness. He thought about how many people he had driven away, friends, colleagues, even family, all sacrificed on the altar of his ego. He no longer saw power as pride. He saw it as debt, a debt he owed to the countless hearts he had bruised. And yet even with this awareness, change came awkwardly. He would still catch himself snapping at staff, still feel the old anger rise like smoke, but each time he stopped himself, inhaled, and forced humility through gritted teeth. It wasn't easy. Redemption, he realized, wasn't about perfection. It was about persistence. Amelia noticed it too. The once untouchable man had begun asking questions instead of issuing commands. He lingered near the kitchen to help carry trays. When his mother's health worsened, he was the one to sit by her side through the long nights, holding her hand with trembling sincerity. There were moments when she would wake from her shallow sleep, look at him through fading eyes and whisper, "You're starting to look like your father again." That single sentence, said with both love and sorrow, would leave him sleepless until dawn. Amelia often found him there, slouched in the armchair by the window, his face tired, his suit jacket draped over the couch. She didn't say much. She just placed a cup of tea beside him. Sometimes, silence was all the forgiveness a person could offer. But one evening, when the rain fell hard against the glass and thunder rumbled over the hills, Alexander finally spoke what had been buried deep inside. "Do you think a man can fix the damage he caused?" he asked. Amelia turned toward him, her expression unreadable but soft. "You can't fix everything," she replied slowly. "But you can stop breaking what's left. Sometimes that's enough." Her words lingered, haunting yet healing. It was then that Alexander decided to face the world he had built, the empire that mirrored his cruelty. The next week, during a board meeting filled with polished suits and cautious faces, he stood up and announced a new policy, one that focused on welfare, fair wages, and rebuilding the culture he had destroyed. There was disbelief, even laughter from those who had once feared him. "You've gone soft," one of his senior partners scoffed. "This isn't charity work." But Alexander didn't respond with anger. He simply looked around the table and said, "No, it's humanity, something we've all forgotten how to afford." The silence that followed was heavy and unfamiliar. But for the first time, he didn't care if he was mocked. He had found a different kind of power, the power to care even when it made him vulnerable. That night, when he returned home, the house felt different. The air no longer suffocated him. His mother, now too weak to speak, smiled faintly when she saw him. Amelia stood nearby, her eyes glimmering with something unspoken, pride perhaps, or maybe relief. And as he held his mother's hand in that dimly lit room, Alexander realized that redemption wasn't about changing the past. It was about building a present worthy enough to forgive it. The silence. After the storm, the weeks after Alexander's boardroom announcement changed the rhythm of everything. His company, once driven purely by numbers and fear, began to breathe again. The employees, cautious at first, didn't quite believe the transformation they were witnessing. But they watched, waited, and slowly began to hope. The millionaire who once barked orders now walked through the factory floor with his sleeves rolled up, greeting workers by name, asking about their families. He attended meetings not to dominate, but to listen. There was something profoundly unsettling yet inspiring about it. To see a man who had once stood like a stone pillar, now softened into something human. Yet even in that gentler rhythm, Alexander carried a shadow, the knowledge that redemption had a price, and he would have to keep paying it. Change did not erase his past. It only offered him the courage to live with it. One evening, after another long day at the company, he returned home to find Amelia reading to his mother. The elderly woman's breathing had grown shallow, her hands frail against the white sheets. Amelia's voice was soft, almost like music, weaving warmth through the coldness of the room. Alexander stood at the doorway, motionless, watching the scene, the flicker of the lamp, the rain outside, the calm patience in Amelia's eyes. Something inside him ached, not with desire but with a deep, wordless admiration. When the story ended and his mother drifted to sleep, Amelia closed the book and looked up. "She waits for you," she said quietly. "Even when she sleeps, she waits for you to talk to her." Her tone carried neither accusation nor pity, just truth. And so Alexander sat beside his mother, taking her fragile hand into his. "I was cruel for so long," he whispered, voice cracking under the weight of everything he never said. "You deserved a better son." The old woman stirred slightly, and though her eyes remained closed, a faint smile touched her lips. "I just wanted you to be kind," she murmured, almost inaudibly. "Now you are." It was the last full sentence she ever spoke. Her passing came quietly, like a candle flickering out at dawn. The house was filled with silence, not the heavy kind that once haunted him, but a sacred, aching stillness. Amelia was the one who held him upright as he stood by the casket, her presence grounding him when his knees trembled. He didn't cry publicly, not out of pride, but because grief was something he carried differently now. In the days that followed, he retreated into himself, walking through empty rooms that felt even emptier without his mother's laughter. But one night, while going through her old belongings, he found a small letter tucked inside a photo frame. It was addressed to him. In his mother's careful handwriting were the words, "If you ever read this, it means I'm gone. I just want you to remember that kindness doesn't make you weak. It makes you whole. Find the people who remind you what love looks like and never let pride take them away again." Alexander sat there for a long time, holding that letter close, tears blurring the ink. It was then he realized what his mother had always seen, that love was not a luxury, not something to be earned through power or status. It was a daily act of courage. And when he looked up, he saw Amelia standing at the doorway, her expression tender, understanding everything without a word. He stood, crossed the room, and simply said, "Thank you for staying." She smiled faintly, replying, "You didn't need saving, Mr. Rowe. You just needed reminding." From that moment, the mansion didn't feel like a monument of wealth anymore. It felt like the beginning of peace. The kind of peace that only arrives after you've faced every storm and survived not as who you were, but as who you chose to become. The legacy of the Lake months had passed since the day the police left and Carol's empire began to crumble. The calm that now rested over Lake Ashbourne was unlike anything Drew Sullivan had ever known. It wasn't just quiet, it was alive, filled with the hum of wind through the trees, the gentle lap of water against the dock, and the laughter of families who finally felt free to enjoy the lake again without fear of pink visor patrols or bogus citations. For Drew, it was more than peace. It was vindication. But deep down he knew that the story wasn't over yet. Freedom, he had learned, was not something handed to you. It was something you earned, fought for, and then protected so it would never be taken again. The months following the court's decision were a whirlwind. Inspectors from the Environmental Agency oversaw the removal of illegal structures. The private beach was stripped of its gated fences, returning to its natural shoreline, open to the public as it had always been meant to be. The county crews tore down the HOA's boat launch, their excavators groaning under the weight of steel beams that had once stood as a symbol of Carol's control. Locals gathered along the lakeside to watch, some bringing folding chairs and thermoses, others just standing silently, taking it in, the dismantling of tyranny, one metal bar at a time. When the last of the pink HOA member-only signs came down, a cheer echoed across the water. Drew stood at the edge of his dock, hands in his pockets, feeling the moment settle into history. The lake was finally free, but even victory has its shadows. Carol Peaton, once the self-declared queen of the lake, had vanished from public view after her courtroom collapse. Rumors spread. Some said she'd sold her house and moved to another town. Others claimed she was trying to start a new HOA under a different name. Drew didn't care to know. For him, revenge had never been the goal. It had been about justice, about restoring what his uncle Frank had built, a place meant for peace, not control. And so, he kept his focus on rebuilding. The cabin that had once been surrounded by Carol's spies was now a gathering place. Neighbors brought food, kids splashed in the shallows, and laughter carried across the lake again. Drew restored the old dock, added a bench where he often sat in the evenings, watching the sunset spread across the rippling water. One evening, as orange light painted the horizon, an elderly man named Tom, one of Carol's oldest victims, came by with a box in his hands. Inside were dozens of folded papers, HOA fines, violation letters, and absurd official warnings from Carol herself. Tom chuckled as he dropped them into the fire pit beside the dock. "Figured it's time to give these a proper send-off," he said. The flames caught, curling the paper, sending ashes into the breeze. Other neighbors joined, bringing their own stacks. Laughter filled the air as they watched the old tyranny burn away. When it was Drew's turn, he held up his own letter, the very first one Carol had ever written him, where she had declared herself president for life. He smiled faintly, tossed it into the flames, and whispered, "Not anymore." As the fire burned low, a local news crew arrived to film a segment about the community's transformation. Drew wasn't one for cameras, but when they asked him to speak, he agreed. Standing by the water, he looked straight into the lens and said, "This lake doesn't belong to one person or one group. It belongs to everyone who respects it, everyone who loves it enough to protect it." We learned something here. Control and community aren't the same thing. You can't force people to belong. You have to give them a reason to want to. The word struck a chord. The segment aired across the state, and soon Drew's story became a symbol of what can happen when ordinary people stand up to abuse of power. Letters poured in from other neighborhoods, people sharing their own battles with overreaching HOAs. Drew responded to every one of them he could, encouraging them to know their rights, to fight smart, to stay kind even when they were angry. By spring, the lake had taken on a new identity. The local government officially declared Ashbourne a community heritage site, ensuring its protection from privatization. The once exclusive shoreline was now a shared treasure. Fishermen, artists, and hikers all found their place there. Drew, inspired by the journey, started a small foundation in his uncle's name, the Frank Sullivan Lake Trust, dedicated to environmental preservation and community rights. It wasn't about fame or profit. It was about leaving something honest behind, something that couldn't be twisted by greed or vanity. On the day of the dedication, the crowd gathered near the dock where it had all begun. Drew spoke briefly, his voice steady and full of quiet gratitude. Uncle Frank used to say that a lake reflects not just the sky, but the people who care for it. For a while, ours reflected fear. Now, it reflects freedom, and that's worth protecting. After the ceremony, as people drifted away, Drew remained at the water's edge. The setting sun shimmered across the ripples like molten gold, the air cool and clean. He could almost hear his uncle's laugh in the wind, feel the weight of all those long, hard days lift from his shoulders. He took a deep breath, the scent of pine and water filling his lungs. This place, once nearly stolen by arrogance and greed, had become something greater, a symbol of what persistence and decency could achieve. Drew had arrived at the lake to find peace for himself. Instead, he had restored peace for everyone. The next morning, I went into town. At the county office, I requested property maps and jurisdiction records. The clerk, a kind older man named George, raised his eyebrows when I mentioned the HOA. "Oh, her again," he muttered. "You're not the first she's tried to strong-arm. But I'll tell you this, and your land's clean. Always has been. Not a single HOA claim in the books. He showed me records going back 50 years. The land I owned wasn't just separate, it was exempt. The cabin had been grandfathered under old county zoning before Cedar Shores even existed. I took copies of everything. Legal surveys, maps, zoning rulings. And as I left, George called out, "Good luck, son. If you're going after her, you'll need it." But about time someone did. When I got back home, Linda was waiting by my driveway, clipboard in hand. "Mr. Parker," she said sweetly, "I hope you've had time to reflect on your behavior. The board is willing to let you join officially if you agree to our conditions." "Conditions?" I asked warily. She smiled wider. "A $2,000 compliance fee, plus written acknowledgement that all future property modifications must meet HOA standards." I stared at her. "You're blackmailing me." Her eyes hardened. "Call it community harmony." That was the final straw. I didn't shout. I didn't argue. I just smiled and said, "You'll be hearing from me soon, Linda." That night I spread all my documents on the table. Deeds, maps, county records, zoning rulings, even environmental protection boundaries. As I looked at the lake through the cabin window, I noticed something strange. The HOA's private dock, the one Linda constantly bragged about, extended far past its property line, into state-protected shoreline. The more I dug, the more rot I found. Illegal expansions, unauthorized construction, even blocked public access paths that should have been open to everyone. By midnight, I had gathered everything. By sunrise, I'd made the calls to the county, to the State Environmental Department, to the Department of Natural Resources. Linda Crawford had spent years pretending to own the lake. She was about to learn who really did. The war she didn't see coming. The following week unfolded like the calm before a storm, though every instinct in my gut told me something massive was about to shift. The lake, as always, was beautiful, silent, glassy, reflecting clouds like a mirror too perfect to be real. But beneath that peace was tension, invisible humming ready to snap. Every morning I woke up to the sound of birds and wind through pine needles, but lately there was something else too. The faint click of a camera shutter from across the road. Linda hadn't stopped her surveillance. Her so-called community compliance team now operated in shifts, patrolling like self-appointed guardians of decency. They even wore badges, real metal badges engraved with CSEA enforcement. I couldn't help but laugh the first time I saw one up close when they tried to hand me another fine. It was as if they were cosplaying a police force. But what started as ridiculous soon became invasive. I couldn't mow the small patch of grass without someone noting it down. When my cousin Jake came to help repair a porch step, one of Linda's lieutenants appeared within minutes to inform us that unauthorized external contractors weren't allowed without HOA approval. Jake, being a mechanic and not the type to mince words, told her exactly what she could do with her clipboard. That resulted in a handwritten disciplinary citation for both of us, taped to my front door the next morning. Linda's power wasn't in any law or rule book. It was in fear. She ran Cedar Shores Estates with a mixture of intimidation and pettiness that had cowed nearly everyone, but fear loses its grip when someone refuses to bow to it. I had made up my mind. I wasn't just going to ignore her anymore. I was going to dismantle the entire illusion she built her authority upon. The first step was gathering evidence. Every document I could find about the lake, the HOA boundaries, environmental regulations, I compiled them all. My dining table was buried in maps, surveys, and copies of zoning documents. The more I read, the more my disbelief turned into quiet anger. Cedar Shores Estates wasn't supposed to have any control over the shoreline. The county had specifically classified the area within 15 feet of the lake as state-owned and publicly accessible. Yet the HOA had built private docks, fencing, even a gated residents-only beach area that cut off people from reaching the water. I contacted the county zoning department again, this time speaking directly to a woman named Laura Meadows. She was sharp, no nonsense, and clearly familiar with Linda's antics. When I explained what I'd found and sent over copies of the maps, her tone shifted from polite interest to focused determination. "Mr. Parker," she said, "if your evidence is accurate, Cedar Shores is in serious violation of both zoning and environmental protection laws. They can't legally restrict lake access or build on protected shoreline. Do you mind if I forward this to the State Environmental Division?" I told her to go ahead. 3 days later, a black SUV with the state seal parked near the HOA's private dock. Out stepped 2 inspectors in green jackets carrying clipboards and measuring equipment. I watched from my porch with a mug of coffee, trying not to smile as Linda came sprinting down the path like a furious peacock. Her voice carried even across the water, shrill, defensive, indignant. She tried to tell the inspectors they were trespassing on private property. They calmly reminded her that the lakefront was public land, and they had full authority to inspect it. I didn't hear the rest of the conversation, but by the time they left, Linda's face was the color of raw beetroot. Her compliance team gathered around her like loyal subjects after a lost battle, whispering and gesturing in my direction as if I were some dark sorcerer who'd cursed their queen. Over the next week, more officials came. The county surveyor arrived to confirm property lines. Then someone from the wetlands department came to take soil samples. Even a crew from the Department of Natural Resources inspected the HOA's new boat ramp, which I suspected had been built without permits. Linda was everywhere, following them from site to site, waving papers, shouting about conspiracies and harassment. But no amount of bluster could erase the evidence piling up against her. Her so-called private beach was built on land that didn't belong to the HOA. The decorative retaining wall they'd installed 2 years ago had disrupted natural water flow into the marshlands. Their fence violated public access laws. It was as if every part of their little empire was stitched together with arrogance instead of legality. While Linda was busy defending herself to the authorities, I finally began to meet my neighbors properly. Without her watching over them, people actually talked. I met Tom and Jenny, who lived 3 houses down, a quiet couple who confessed they'd been fined $300 because their dog's bark disrupted the tranquility of the community. Then there was Rose, an elderly widow who had tears in her eyes as she told me Linda had made her remove the flower boxes her late husband had built because they were non-conforming aesthetic elements. I realized this wasn't just about one stubborn woman and her power trip. This was about an entire neighborhood that had forgotten it had a voice. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills and the lake turned molten gold, a few of us gathered by the shore. Tom brought beer, Rose brought cookies, and we just talked about the old days, about what peace used to feel like before every small act came with a fine or a threat. There was laughter, hesitant at first, then freer. I remember thinking that this was how communities were supposed to feel. Not ruled, but shared. When I got home that night, there was a letter taped to my front door. Thick paper typed neatly, sealed with the HOA logo embossed in gold. It read, "Notice of legal action. You are hereby informed that your recent actions, including unauthorized communications with state agencies and defamation of the Cedar Shores Estates Homeowners Association, constitute harassment and interference with community governance. Cease and desist immediately or face civil penalties." At the bottom was Linda's signature in elegant cursive, followed by President Cedar Shores Estates HOA. I laughed out loud. She actually thought she could intimidate me with fake legalese. What she didn't realize was that her letter, combined with her recorded outbursts to the inspectors, would soon be used as evidence, and not against me, but against her. The next day, I sent copies of everything to Laura from the zoning department. She forwarded it to the county attorney's office, and by Friday, official notices were being served. Cedar Shores Estates was under investigation for multiple violations, including illegal construction and harassment of non-member property owners. Linda's reign began to crumble faster than even I expected. The gossip spread like wildfire. For years, people had whispered behind her back, but now they were talking openly. The same neighbors who once feared her fines were now comparing notes, pulling out folders full of old violations, and realizing how ridiculous it had all been. The HOA's treasurer, a soft-spoken man named Henry Collins, stopped by my cabin one afternoon looking defeated. "Ethan," he said quietly, "I think you should know, the board is divided. Half of us think Linda's gone too far. The other half are scared to oppose her because she's threatened to sue anyone who votes against her decisions. But the state investigation, well, that's changing things.